In this tutorial, we'll be walking through all the ways the transform shortcuts can be used to create new vectors and edit existing without the need for text form entry. Depending upon the way you work, this can dramatically reduce the time taken to create a design. Personally, I see the greatest benefit in creating new polyline entries, moving vectors or points on vectors, as well as scaling and rotating objects. However, as well as polyline entries, it can also be used to create primitives such as circles, ellipses, rectangles, polygons, and stars, and we'll cover all of these operations in the presentation. Now, before we start looking at the way we can edit vectors, let's take a look at the core creation tools first. However, before we start demonstrating, it should be noted that all the transform shortcut operations are explained within the keyboard shortcuts that can be accessed from the Help drop-down menu. So from within the software, select Help, Keyboard Shortcuts. You'll be presented with this part of the Help system, and if you scroll down, you'll see the area Quick Keys or Transform Shortcuts, along with an explanation of how to rotate, scale, move nodes, create polyline entries using these transform shortcuts, which are also called quick keys. So we'll be covering most of the options, not all, but certainly the ones that are most commonly used. So with that, I'm just going to minimize that and come back to the software. And we created a new part here, which is just 10 by 10. And I'm going to switch on the grid here, the grid points, which are shown at 0.5 inch intervals. If we look under Edit Snap Options, which is F4 on the keyboard, you can see that our angular step is set to 15 degrees and we have our grid spacing set at ½ an inch. So with that now, we can start to move on and start creating some entries, and we will start with Polyline. Now, before we go and start creating any polylines, let's go back and refer to the Help system. So under the Quick Keys or Transform Shortcuts section, you've got a lot of items initially to do with editing, but let's go to some of the creation tools here, and we're going to be dealing with Polyline. And of course, there are a selection of parameters here that allow you to be able to specify certain things about the length of a line without using the form entry. So let's go back to the menu and come up to Polyline, and I'm just going to start by creating my first point. You can see the grid line there reference, so I'm going to use start at 1 1, and as you can see, I'm now free to create my next point. So you can of course use the shortcut keys to enter a value by looking at the menu on the screen, but if I wanted to enter a distance in a particular direction without having to move my cursor, then I can use the transform shortcuts. So with this, I'm going to go upwards in Y by 3. So I'm just moving my cursor along the line that I want the distance to continue, and I hit 3 on the keyboard, and you'll notice in the lower right hand corner, roughly where my cursor here, you'll see the value that I'm about to enter onto the keyboard appear at the bottom of the screen. So I'm just going to move in the direction. I hit 3 on the keyboard. You can see the value 3 now in the bottom right hand corner. I just hit return, and that will have incrementally created a new point, distance 3 in Y from the previous point. I can do the same if I want to go along in X. I can enter a value of 2 and hit return, and that will be going in positive X by 2 in the direction that I was moving. If I wanted to do another one, maybe that was at an angle. Now within our snap options, we had an incremental sort of angle of 15 degrees, and you'll see it snaps to those angles very easily, the 30 degrees, and then we've got 45 and 60. So for instance, I can pick up maybe the 30 degree, and I want to go along there by a distance of 2. So it doesn't have to be orthogonal here. I'm going across an angular direction. So I'm going to go across by 2 inches and hit 2 on the keyboard. You can see 2 in the bottom right hand corner, and I hit return, and I will have moved along that by 2 inches. Now, as well as working orthogonally from these sort of snap angles, I can actually specify a particular angle. So with that, rather than just the length, which is all we've been specifying at the moment, I'm going to give a value of the angle plus the length. So in this case, I want from this point, I want to go up at 60 degrees. So that'll be 60A, and you can see that in the right hand corner of A60. And then I'm going to go along a distance of 3 in length, and now we've created a line of length 3 at an angle of 60 degrees from the original point. We can now drop down. So if, for instance, I wanted to create one negative, so if I move my cursor upwards, but I specified, say, -4, then that will actually create a line incrementally -4 inches in Y from that previous point. We can actually specify a distance in both X and Y at the same time. So in this case, I'm just going to, I don't need to move my cursor in any particular position, but I know that I want to move it, say, 2 in X and 3 in Y. So I can just type in 2, 3 and hit return. And that will create a point that's incrementally 2 in X and 3 in Y. Now, finally, if I wanted to create a point at a defined absolute position, and of course now I can come into the entries and type in 5x 5y, and that will have created my next point at an absolute position of 5 5, and as you can see, that is the center of our job space, which happens to be 5 5. So those are all the different options for creating a polyline, and you can see all those options within the help menu. And now we're just going to close out this form, delete the polyline, and we're going to take a look at circles. Okay, so let's close out that form and delete that line, and then we'll come up and take a look at circles. And these can be explained very quickly. So I can, of course, click on the screen and start growing and using the snap options, maybe arrive at the right diameter. Or if I type with the keyboard, then it's going to actually default to the radius. So if I hit 2 and return, that will give me a circle of diameter 4 because I've specified 2 as my radius. Now, if I come to another position and want to specify this with a diameter, once again, I just stretch from the center point, and then I can just type in, rather than 2, which was the radius, I can type in 4D, and that will give me exactly the same as the previous circle where I specified that with a radius of 2, but with this one on the right, I specified that with 4D, specifying the diameter. So those are really the only two options that transform shortcuts have with circles, is to specify either using the radius or using the diameter. So with this now, I'm just going to close out this form and delete these two circles, and we'll move across and take a look at ellipses. Okay, now ellipses are a little bit more complicated because we have an X and a Y distance. So let's go to the Create Vectors menu and open the ellipse form. I'm going to come across to my main window here and just start by clicking the left mouse key, and I'm moving my mouse to specify the X and the Y. Now it can be that the snap options can give me the correct size, but in this case I want to use keyboard entry, i.e. through the transform shortcuts, to specify that X and Y. Well, that's easy to do. If I wanted it 5 in X and 2 in Y, I can just hit 5, 2 and hit return on the keyboard, and I have an ellipse that's a width 5 and a height of 2. Okay, similarly now if I wanted to specify maybe just the height, so I'm going to specify my width. Okay, so I'm going to get that roughly right on. Okay, it's going to be 7 in width. Okay, but I need it to be a height of 2. Then I can just hit 2y, and that will have the current width in X, but with the height that I specified through the keyboard. And similarly, if I want to do the same by specifying the X distance, I can stretch this up now, so I know that I'm going to need it to be 2 in Y, but I need my width to be 7 in X. So I just type 7x. As you can see, I have a width of 7 and a height of 2. Okay, so moving away from ellipses, let's close that form down and then just delete out those vectors, and we're going to start looking at rectangles. So I'm going to come across now and click on the draw rectangle, which will open the form. I'm going to move into my workspace and specify my first corner. So I'm going to click on that corner, and I'm stretching, of course, in X and Y. And I can, if I want to just have a square, type on the keyboard just one value and return, and that will give me a height and a width the same, i.e. a square. So in this case 4, return, and as you can see, we've got a square where the width is 4 and the height is 4. Similarly, if I stretch that out now and want to specify a difference in X and Y, I can hit, say for instance, 4, 3, and that will give me a width of 4 and a height of 3. Now, just like with ellipses, we can use the screen to specify either the X or Y and then use typed entry for the remaining value. So I'm going to start by entering my top left-hand position, and as you can see, I'm stretching the rectangle, and I know in this case I want a width of 2, but my height I want to specify as, say, 5.25. So I can type in 5.25y, and that will give me exactly the correct distance in Y for that parameter. And similarly, if I want to change that and maybe specify the correct distance in Y, but I want to be 4 in X, then I could just type 4x, and that will give me that parameter typed through the keyboard. Okay, so we've explored the rectangle options here, so let's close the form down now and delete out the vectors, and now we're going to take a look at Polygon. So from the Create Vectors menu, the Draw Polygon command, the form pops up, but I'm going to come over to my main screen and just start stretching out. And as you can see here, based upon the parameters in the form, it's giving me a polygon on the screen. So with that, now I can specify if I want that same number of sides. I can specify either the diameter or the radius. The radius will be default, just like we saw with the circle. So if I hit 3 now and hit return, we will get a diameter 6 or radius 3 polygon with the set number of sides, which happens to be 12 in this case. Similarly, I specify that with just a radius. I can do the same by specifying, say, 12D, and you can see that I've given it a diameter of 12. So as well as specifying just the diameter or radius, we can also add in the number of sides we want. So if I'm going to click now and start scaling up, we can see that we're getting 12 sides, but I maybe want to specify this with maybe just 8 sides. So I can do 8s and then specify the radius as 4d, and you can see that we've got a 8-sided polygon with its diameter 4. So that shows the different options for specifying a polygon. We can either specify the radius or diameter based upon the current number of sides, or add into the equation the number of sides and then the diameter or radius following that. Now we're going to move away from polygons to the final sort of creation tool, which is stars. So I'm going to close out the form now, and we're just going to remove these 3 polygons and come up to the remaining create vectors options on the top line here, which is draw star. Coming across to the job space now, and I can simply click my middle mouse key to specify the center point, and as you can see, based upon the parameters in the form, i.e. the number of points being 5, we're getting a star drawn on the screen. So at this point, just like we had with the polygon and with the circle, I can specify either a radius or a diameter, and of course the radius is default. So if I pick 2.5 now, you can see that we have a star of diameter 5 drawn on the screen. And similarly, if I want to do that by specifying the diameter, I can stretch that up and go 5D, and we get exactly the same on the screen. Now moving on from just specifying the radius or diameter of the star, we can start to add in the number of points. As you can see here in the form, it's currently set at 5. So as I start to grow that now, you can clearly see there are 5 points projected on the screen. Now I can add in the number of points by once again using the transform shortcuts. So I'm going to add in 8p, which is going to specify my number of points, followed by the diameter or the radius. In this case, I'm going to go 4D, and we have a 8-pointed star, which is diameter 4. And of course, we have quite a significant gap in the middle because our inner radius percentage is 75% of the outer diameter. So we can actually add into that equation the inner radius as well. So it's a slightly longer term. So I'm going to come in now and start by growing my point. You can see there that we're getting the current parameters as displayed on the form. But let's say, for instance, I wanted to add just 6 points now. So 6p. I want the diameter to be 3D, but before I press that, I'll specify the inner radius percentage. So I'm going to go 50i and then 3D, and we have an 8-pointed star. The diameter is 3 and the inner radius percentage, i.e. the radius inside here, is 50% of the outer one. So you can see that we have 3 values there, and you can join them all together in one term. And if you're particularly quick with the keys and feel that's a better way to do it than using the form, then there is the flexibility to use that through the transform shortcuts. Okay, so we finished all the sort of vector creation tools. Now let's take a look at the ways in which we can move, scale and rotate. So we're going to close out the form now and just delete the current vectors we've got on the screen. And I'm going to create a very simple sort of polyline, just nothing that dramatic, but just so we can start seeing about moving this item around and moving the points on this line around. So I've got a single vector now, and I may wish to try and move this. Now, of course, I can use the move option on the menu, but what I can do is just click on this now to take it into the transform mode, and then hover my left mouse key over any one of the points, and I can start moving this around. So in this case, I want to take this point, and I know that I may want to move this in a distance in Y by 3. So I'm just going along orthogonally in the Y direction. I can hit 3 on the keyboard and hit return, and it will have moved that in positive Y by 3. Similarly, I can take this down and move this negative, or I can move it in X maybe and go 2 and return. So whichever direction I'm moving it in will be the direction that the move happens. So that's just moving it incrementally in just one direction, but I can also do this in 2 at the same time. So I'm going to use this as the anchor point for moving. Okay, so I've just started to move it around. I've got my left mouse key depressed, and I will now want to go maybe 1 in X, so I can go 1, 3, okay, and hit return, and that will have moved it up in Y by 3 and along X by 1. So I'm just going to hit Control Z to bring this back now and back on the screen. So that was an incremental distance in both X and Y at the same time. So that was just 2, 3. So I'm now going to do exactly the same, use the same point here now, but rather than specifying an incremental distance, I can give an absolute position for where I want this to move to. So once again, I've just clicked on the point there and I'm moving this now. I'm not worried about really the direction I'm moving in, because I'm going to specify that I want to move this to where this particular point happens to be at 5, 5. So to do that, rather than using the 5, 5, we have to go 5x 5y, and that will have moved that point to the middle of the screen. As you well know, this is a 10 by 10 part, and you can see that we've moved that to exactly the midpoint on the screen. So that's just the different ways that we can move an item. By moving it incrementally in X and Y along the direction that we want to move. We can also do it incrementally by adding an X and a Y, like 3, 2, or we can do this by specifying an absolute position. In this case, we use, say, for instance, 5X, 5Y without the comma, and that moved the whole item together, where I was moving the original sort of control point from whatever position it was in to 5, 5. Okay, as well as moving a whole entity around, we can start to move individual points on a vector. So with this, I'm just going to come out of the transform mode and go into the node editing mode, and we can see those nodes instrumented on that vector. For the means of this, I'm actually going to switch the grid snapping off so we don't click to any individual point when moving the nodes around. So with this now, I can come across to the individual node. You can see the cursor changes and I'm able to move that. Now you can instantly see that I can come along tangentially, or if I can come off at right angles from an original position, okay, or I can go off obviously orthogonally. Okay, so you've got a lot of different options here as to how you want to move the point. So along any of those directions now, I can simply hit a value. So if I wanted to move this point tangentially along there by distance 1, I can just hit 1, return, and that will have moved that point along that tangentially. If I want to move it off maybe at right angles, we can see that's coming off at right angles now, and I want to go maybe 0.5 along there, that's fine. Or maybe I want to move this in both X and Y, so I can see I can go up in X, up in Y, or along in X, but maybe I want to do both at the same time. So I'm going to go maybe 0.5 in both. So I'm going to go 0.5, 0.5 return, and that will have moved it 0.5 in X, 0.5 and y incrementally from its previous position. Or maybe I want to move this to an absolute position, okay? So if we just move this one out the way, because it's probably going to go to the center, and I'm going to take this one here, and I want to move this to the center of the screen. So with that, I can just type in 5x, 5y, and that snap that point to the center of the screen. So notice there that I didn't use the comma value, because that is where we use it for incremental distances, i.e. 5, 5 would have moved it incrementally in 5 and x and 5 and y. Instead we used 5x, no comma, 5y, and that moved it to the absolute position of 5x, 5y. So that just shows you some of the ways that you can move points around, and like I say, the moving is particularly strong in transform shortcuts, and I use it a lot for either moving entities or points rather than doing it through the form. Okay, so with that now, I'm just going to come out of that, and we're going to take that and just delete that out the way, and we're now going to look at scaling. So with this, I'm going to come across now and just bring up a typical rectangle, and I'm just going to draw that on the screen. So it's 3.6 in x and 1.8 in y. Okay, so as we close that form down and we click on this, we can see it's instrumented now, and I can move it around from the center point, or I can start to stretch it in y or in x or in both of them at the same time. Okay, so with that, I can of course specify now this distance here. So as you can see, I'm moving it in x, and I can specify the length of the rectangle. So in this case, I might say that I want it to be 5 and hit return. And as you can see, that's scaled that, so that x distance is now 5. Or maybe in the y, I maybe want to bring this down to be 1. So I simply hit 1 return, and that will have just a height of 1. As well as specifying the increase in x or y, I can do both at the same time. So I can simply start scaling it now and then specify, say for instance, 4 in x and 3 in y. And we have now a new rectangle, width 4, height 3. Now finally, what we can do is specify a scale factor. So rather than true length in x and y, we'll give it a scale factor. So let's say for instance we wanted this to be double the size. So I can start stretching it now and simply hit 2 on the keyboard for doubling, and then S. And as you can see, we've created a double size rectangle on the screen. So there we've looked at all the scaling parameters, and now we're going to move on and take a look at rotation. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl Z to bring it back to its original size. And you can see in the top right hand corner of the transform mode, the rotation anchor. So as I rotate this, you can see I'm going in clockwise or anti-clockwise, and the angle that we specify will always assume anti-clockwise. So with that, if I'm actually moving this now, even if I'm moving in the positive direction and enter the value 25, it will be rotating this counterclockwise by 25 degrees. So therefore, if I wanted to move it in the clockwise direction by 30, I can just type in -30 return, and that will rotate it by 30 degrees in a clockwise direction. So anti-clockwise is default, clockwise we just use a negative angle. So that quite simply shows us taking the rotation anchor and using the keyboard entry to specify the rotation rather than having to come up to the rotate objects command. And for that now we've covered all the items within transform shortcuts, and please refer to the help notes because all the options are displayed there, of which we've shown most of those within this presentation.